At exactly 6:01 a.m., Jack Merritt opened his eyes. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. In just under 3 hours, the state of California was going to execute him. No appeals left. No more chances. Just a thin mattress, a steel bed frame, and the relentless tick of a clock mounted high above the concrete wall of Pine Ridge Correctional Facility. But Jack wasn't thinking about death. He was thinking about a dog. A German shepherd named Tank. And the one last request that might change everything. The gray morning light didn't reach far into the narrow window of Jack's death row cell. Outside, birds stirred in the tall eucalyptus trees that lined the prison's eastern fence line. Inside, time felt heavier than air. Jack sat up slowly, his broad shoulders hunched beneath the weight of 5 long years in Prison Orange. At 39, the former Navy SEAL looked older than his age, like someone who'd lived too many lives in one skin. His square jaw was peppered with a few days' worth of stubble, and his blue eyes were bloodshot from a night with no sleep. The footsteps came just after 6:15. Measured, deliberate. Warden Alice Grant appeared outside his cell door, her expression unreadable beneath horn-rimmed glasses and a crisp gray uniform. "Mr. Merritt," she said, voice neutral, "your final request is under review." Jack stood. Not with defiance, he'd spent all his anger years ago, but with quiet steadiness. "I want to see my dog, just for a few minutes. Please." "Tank," she confirmed. "The K9? Jack nodded. "He's more than that." Something flickered in the warden's eyes. She had seen men beg, scream, curse. But not this. Not a man asking without shame to say goodbye to a dog. "I'll call Miss Taylor," she said after a pause. "If she can bring him in time, you'll have 15 minutes. Jack sat back down as the footsteps faded. He exhaled slowly, gripping the side of the bunk. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope for something. Not freedom, not even mercy. Just closure. 5 miles away, in a quiet craftsman-style house shaded by redwoods, Abby Taylor jolted awake to the sound of her phone vibrating violently on the nightstand. The dream had been so vivid. Jack spinning her around at the beach. Tank barking joyfully, the sun setting behind them. She fumbled for the phone. "Hello, Ms. Taylor. This is Warden Grant from Pine Ridge. Jack Merritt has requested a visit with his service animal. We understand you've had custody of the dog." Abby sat up straight, her breath catching in her throat. "Tank, yes. He's with me. If you can be at the facility by 7:45, we'll allow it. But you must understand, it's highly irregular." "I'll be there," Abby said, heart pounding. She hung up, her hands trembling, and glanced at the framed photo by the bed Jack, kneeling beside Tank the day they adopted him. The dog was already scarred then, his muzzle bearing a jagged line that shelter staff said made him unadoptable. But Jack had only smiled. "He looks like someone who's been through hell and still stood up," Jack had said. "I know, the type." She moved to the living room where Tank lay curled on his old bed, eyes barely opening as she approached. 9 now, the German shepherd had aged noticeably since Jack's arrest. The once strong frame was thinner, and the playful spark in his eyes had dimmed, but when Abby knelt down and whispered, "We're going to see Jack," his ears perked up. Tank lifted his head. Then slowly, with effort, he stood. He remembered. Jack's cell was colder than usual, the metal sink at the corner still dripping from a loose valve. He sat with his back against the wall, staring at nothing. The prison chaplain, Reverend Nolan, sat quietly across from him. "You think dogs go to heaven?" Jack asked. The Reverend smiled gently. "I believe God wouldn't separate those who love each other deeply." Jack looked down. "That dog saved my life more than once, not just overseas. When I came back, the nightmares, the guilt, he'd Just lay across my chest like he could anchor me. Sounds like he knew you better than anyone. Yeah, Jack whispered. Maybe better than me. Detective Roy Hanover was already awake, surrounded by piles of evidence boxes in his cluttered home office. The Montgomery case file lay open on his desk, the top corner folded from repeated handling. Something had been bothering him for weeks. He'd built the case himself, had testified under oath that the fingerprint on the knife, the bank deposit, and the overheard argument made it open and shut. But last night, while flipping through a supplemental file he hadn't touched in years, he saw it. A notation in red. Inconclusive. Print doesn't match known suspects. Except it had never been entered into trial evidence, and the handwriting on the log looked fresh. Damn it, he muttered. He reached for his phone and started dialing the warden's office. At 7:38 a.m., Abby pulled into the gravel lot outside, Pine Ridge. Tank belted into the back seat, stared ahead with the quiet intensity of a soldier reporting for duty. As they exited the car, a guard eyed the dog warily. "He's with me," said Warden Grant, who had come to escort them personally. "Is he trained?" she asked, nodding toward the large shepherd. "He's Jack's PTSD support dog." Abby replied, "And former military canine, he'll behave." "Let's go," Grant said. They passed through 3 checkpoints, the last of which buzzed loudly before a thick door opened to the inner wing of the prison. Abby's breath caught in her throat when she saw Jack through the small observation window. He looked thinner, paler, but his eyes, they lit up when he saw her, and then they landed on Tank. If this story has your heart racing, don't forget to subscribe to Heroes for Animals for more powerful, real-life stories of loyalty, justice, and second chances. The second the door opened, Tank froze. He stared at Jack with the wide-eyed stillness of recognition that cut through years of separation. Then, with a sudden whimper, half joy, half sorrow, he lunged forward. Abby let go of the leash. There was no stopping him. Tank bounded across the room and threw himself into Jack's arms, whining, licking, pawing, tail wagging like a flag, in a storm. Jack wrapped his arms around the dog and held on as if the world were ending. "Hey, buddy," he whispered into Tank's fur. "Hey there, my good boy." Abby stepped back, tears spilling silently. "He remembered me," Jack said, voice cracking. "After all this time." "Every day," Abby whispered. "He waits by the window, every single day." Tank stilled for a moment, nose twitching at Jack's jumpsuit pocket. Then he pawed at it insistently. "What's he doing?" asked the warden, watching from the door. Jack reached into his pocket. "It's just a scrap of my old jacket. They let me keep it." But Tank began trembling, whining louder. He pressed his nose to the fabric like it carried something urgent, something only he could smell. Abby's eyes widened. "He's trying to tell us something." Just then the door opened again. "Warden," a guard interrupted. "Detective, Hanover's here. He says it's urgent. Something about Mr. Merritt's case." The warden frowned. "The detective who built the case?" "Yes, ma'am." Tank growled. Low, deep. Not at anyone in the room, but at the memory that scent had just unlocked. Jack looked down at the dog and back at the warden. "Something's not right," he said. And in that moment, the countdown clock on Jack Merritt's execution began to shift, not toward death, but toward truth. Detective Roy Hanover had worked more murder cases than he could remember, but none had ever followed him into his dreams. At 5:43 a.m., he sat at the edge of his bed in sweatpants and an old Marine Corps t-shirt, staring at a yellowing case file from 5 years ago. People think justice is clean, he thought, but most of the time, it's duct tape and doubt. He hadn't planned to revisit the Merritt file. That ship had sailed. Trial, conviction, death sentence. But last night, something about the fingerprint evidence had gnawed at him. In the original log, one line, written in different handwriting, had caught his eye. Inconclusive. Sample 3C. That sample had never been discussed at trial. More than that, it had vanished. Hanover grabbed his phone and called the prison. Back. At Pine Ridge, Jack sat with his hand still resting on Tank's scruff, the air thick with unspoken questions. Tank stood in front of him like a statue, eyes locked on the cloth scrap Jack had just pulled from his pocket. Detective Hanover's here, the warden repeated. Says it's urgent. He has something on your case. Jack's brow furrowed. Hanover. He's the guy who put me in here. He's also the reason we're calling the governor's office, she said flatly. He thinks the trial may have overlooked critical evidence. Tank let out a low rumble, his tail stiff behind him. Abby had never seen him act this way, not even during active canine duty drills. I don't know what it means, Jack said softly, brushing Tank's ears. But it's like he remembers something I don't. The governor's office issued a 2-hour stay of execution at exactly 8:21 a.m. That meant Jack had until 11 p.m. After that, unless something new surfaced, the clock would resume ticking. Warden Grant escorted Abby and Tank to a secure family visitation room. You can stay with him, she told Abby, but keep Tank leashed. We're bending rules as it is. Thank you, Abby said. Tank trotted beside her, obedient but alert. His movements were stiff, arthritis maybe, but his eyes never stopped scanning, as if searching for more than just danger, as if searching for meaning. Jack sat at the center table, rubbing his hands, together, still reeling from the emotional whiplash. Why would Hanover show up now? He asked. Abby shrugged. Regret, maybe, or guilt. Jack looked down at Tank, who had settled under the table with one paw on Jack's foot, eyes closed but body tight. I think he knows, Jack murmured. Whatever happened that night, this dog remembers. Detective Hanover arrived at the warden's office with a briefcase and a folder of notes he hadn't touched in half a decade. At 62, he still walked like a Marine, straight-backed, brisk. But there was something in his face that said he'd seen one too many tragedies. You've got 45 minutes tops, Grant told him. That's all I need. He spread out, a dozen sheets on her desk. Phone records, photos, evidence logs. The night Brent Landon was murdered, a burner phone registered to a man named Travis Galt pinged within half a mile of the penthouse. Galt's name never came up during the trial, because someone buried it. Why would they do that? Because Galt is a fixer, Hanover said, paid to clean up messes for rich men with secrets. He disappeared 2 days after Jack was arrested. The warden crossed her arms. This is all circumstantial. Not all. Hanover pulled out a crime scene photo. Landon's Rolex. It's visible in early photos, damaged but intact. But there's no Rolex listed in the final inventory. Are you saying evidence went missing? I'm saying someone didn't want that watch examined. In the visitation room, Abby sat quietly, watching Jack stroke Tank's head. The dog had become unnaturally still. There's something I haven't told you, she said finally. Jack looked up. I'm pregnant, she whispered. 12 weeks. It's yours. Jack's world spun sideways. The last time they'd been together, 2 months ago, had felt like a stolen dream, desperate, hopeful, wrapped in finality. He stared at her, trying to process the weight of what she had just said. A baby, he said, voice cracking. Ours? Abby nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. I didn't want you to die without knowing. You have something waiting for you. Something worth fighting for. Tank let out a soft, understanding whine. He nudged Jack's knee with his nose, like he knew exactly what was being said. Jack reached out and took Abby's hand. Meanwhile, in Abby's small cottage, morning light streamed through gauzy curtains. Dust motes danced in the silence as the house sat empty, for now. In the bedroom, Tank's bed still lay in the corner, dented by years of loyal use. Abby's photo frames lined the dresser, her, Jack, and Tank at the beach, another of Tank in A service vest standing alert next to a crowd of children. But beneath the bed something waited. Tank's old gym bag, a tear in the lining, and inside, something small and metallic that had been hidden for 5 long years. At 9:14 a.m., back at the prison, Abby's phone buzzed. A neighbor was feeding her cats and had texted a photo of something odd she'd found under Abby's bed while looking for Tank's old leash. The image showed a thin, broken metal cylinder, a watch stem. Abby's blood ran cold. "That's Brent Landon's watch," she whispered. "It has to be." She stood so fast her chair nearly fell over. "I have to show this to Hanover." Tank, as if sensing the urgency, leapt to his feet and stood between Jack and the door. "You knew," Jack whispered. "You knew all along." Warden Grant's office phone rang. She picked it up. "Ma'am?" said the voice of a state legal assistant. "The governor's chief counsel has reviewed the new material. They're granting a 48-hour stay." Grant didn't react. She simply turned to Hanover. "You've got 2 days. Make it count." The next hour was a flurry. Hanover contacted Judge Melton's chambers for an emergency evidentiary hearing. The Rolex stem Abby found was transported under evidence chain protocol, and Travis Galt, missing for years, was picked up by TSA trying to board a flight to Brazil. By 10:37 a.m., he was in custody. That night, back at the cottage, Tank lay exhausted in his bed. He'd barely eaten, and his breathing was more labored than usual. Abby sat beside him, stroking the fur between his ears. "You carried that thing inside you," she said quietly. "For 5 years. You knew. You tried to tell us. And we didn't listen." Tank didn't respond, but his eyes opened just enough to meet hers. Tired. Wise. Faithful. Back in his temporary holding cell, Jack stood at the window, looking out at nothing. Abby entered quietly, holding a copy of the state's official order for stay of execution. She set it down beside him. "They gave us 48 hours. Jack turned toward her, eyes raw. "It's not over yet," she said. Tank lay curled up on the floor beside them. Jack knelt and placed a hand on the dog's side. "Whatever happens, you saved me," he whispered. Tank lifted his head, just slightly, and rested it in Jack's lap. In Sacramento, the governor stood on a balcony outside his office, reading the latest press coverage. "Wrong man. New evidence could overturn death sentence." His chief of staff approached, looking grim. "We've got a storm coming," she said. The governor didn't respond at first. Then he turned slowly. "Let it come," he said. "We're not burying this." The courtroom didn't look like a place where lives changed. It was just 4 walls and flickering fluorescent lights, rows of wooden benches, a single polished podium beneath the seal of the state. But for Jack Merritt, this small room inside the Oceanside County Courthouse might as well have been the final battlefield. And he wasn't walking into it alone. Tank was at his side. It was the first time a dog had ever been granted presence at an emergency evidentiary hearing in California, let alone one held with only 48 hours' notice. But the judge, Marianne Winters, known for her no-nonsense rulings and absolute dedication to the Constitution, had agreed after hearing how the German Shepherd's behavior had led to the discovery of the watch stem. Jack sat beside his public defender, Adam Lowry, in a borrowed gray suit and freshly shaved face. He barely recognized himself in the courtroom reflection. Across the aisle, Assistant District Attorney Gregory Vance sat flanked by 2 junior prosecutors, his jaw tight. Tank, though, looked entirely himself. He lay at Jack's feet, head resting on his paws, eyes moving slowly across the room. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Everyone seemed to know they were witnessing something bigger than one man's trial. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. "The Honorable Judge Winters presiding." The judge entered with a calm gravity that silenced the room. We're here today to review new evidence submitted in the matter of State versus Jack Merritt, she began. Mr. Merritt's execution was postponed pending this emergency hearing. You will present only verified facts. No speculation, no theatrics. She glanced at the ADA. Is that understood, Mr. Vance? Yes, Your Honor, he replied, his voice clipped. Then let's begin. Detective Roy Hanover was the first to take the stand. He explained the re-examination of the Montgomery case, the discrepancies in the evidence logs, and the recently recovered phone data pointing to Travis Gault, a man never mentioned at trial. But it was when he mentioned the missing Rolex watch that the courtroom stirred. That watch, Hanover said, holding up a photograph, was visible in every crime scene image taken in the first 20 minutes after discovery. But it was never entered into evidence. 3 days after the murder, it was checked out by someone from the DA's office and never returned. Do you have proof of that? The judge asked. Hanover produced a document with Gregory Vance's signature on the transfer log. Gasps echoed across the courtroom. Vance shifted in his seat but didn't speak. Hanover continued. And this... He held up a sealed evidence bag containing the broken watch stem. Was found in Mr. Merritt's gym bag at home, planted there. It matches the Rolex owned by Brent Montgomery. Abby was called next. She approached the witness stand in a modest black blouse, her hair tied back. Her hands trembled as she placed them on the railing. Ms. Taylor, Judge Winters said gently, you may proceed. I live with Tank, she began, Jack's service dog. After his arrest, I took him in. For years, Tank waited by the front window every day, and he never forgot Jack. I didn't realize it at first, but he was trying to tell me something. She recounted how, the night of the murder, Tank had acted out of character, obsessively pawing at Jack's leather jacket. At the time, she thought it was anxiety. Looking back, it was something else. He was trying to remove something, she said, trying to alert us. And you later found the broken stem? Judge Winters asked. Yes. He led me to it, in an old gym bag. The judge nodded solemnly, then turned to the defense. Anything else? Yes, Your Honor, said Lowry. We called Dr. Elaine Sorensen to the stand. Dr. Sorensen was the state's forensic veterinary pathologist. She had examined Tank after the discovery of the watch stem. We performed a scan, she explained, and found a small, irregular object embedded near his stomach lining. Upon removal, we confirmed it was a metal watch, stem matching the missing Rolex. Could the dog have swallowed it intentionally? The judge asked. No, but he could have picked it up and swallowed it while chewing fabric. Dogs in distress often fixate on objects. The important thing is, it remained inside him, encased and preserved. Jack watched as Tank turned his head, slightly, eyes flicking toward the sound of the vet's voice. His scarred muzzle was still, but his eyes glowed with awareness. He had carried the truth in his body, and no one had listened. Lowry stood. Your Honor, we move to vacate the conviction on the grounds of prosecutorial misconduct, planted evidence, and the emergence of an alternate suspect who has now been taken into custody. Objection, Vance barked. This is based on the word of a dog and a career detective trying to save face. Judge Winters held up a hand. Mr. Vance, if your office failed to disclose exculpatory evidence, this is not about a dog's word. It's about due process. And how do you explain this? Lowry asked, stepping forward with a supplemental motion. A sworn deposition from Travis Gault himself, admitting to planting the stem and the fabric inside Merritt's truck. He also states he was paid by 3 investors in the Coastal Haven development to silence Montgomery before he went public, with evidence of zoning. Fraud, Vance opened his mouth, then closed it. He had nothing. Judge Winters called for a brief recess. During the break, Jack sat on the bench in the hallway with Abby beside him. Tank leaned against Jack's leg, letting out a soft sigh. Do you think it's enough? Jack asked. I don't know, Abby admitted. But I think the truth is finally louder than the lies. Jack smiled faintly. He waited. 5 years. That dog didn't just remember me. He remembered what happened. He's the reason we're here. Abby placed a hand on his. He's not done fighting. When court resumed, Judge Winters returned to the bench with a firm expression. I've reviewed the evidence, and it's my determination that Jack Merritt's conviction was fundamentally flawed. The combination of suppressed material, planted evidence, and a coerced narrative point toward deliberate misconduct. Therefore, I am vacating the conviction and ordering Mr. Merritt's immediate release. The courtroom erupted. Jack couldn't move at first. Then he turned, knelt, and wrapped his arms around Tank. The dog whimpered, tail thumping lightly, as if he knew. You did it, Jack whispered. You saved me. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed the steps. Some chanted, others held signs. One read, "Free at last because of a dog." Jack exited the building with Abby and Tank at his side. Cameras flashed. Questions flew. But Jack kept walking, one hand on Abby's back, the other holding Tank's leash. They didn't speak until they reached the sidewalk. Then Jack turned toward the dog, bent down and looked him in the eye. You never gave up on me, he said. Tank gave a single bark. Sharp, clear, and in that moment, Jack Merritt felt something he hadn't in 5 years. Peace. 3 days after Jack Merritt walked out of prison, the small cottage on Seaview Drive overflowed with people who had once doubted him, and those who had never stopped believing. It wasn't a party. Not exactly. No balloons, no music, no champagne. Just quiet conversation, a few warm casseroles, and the shared relief that the system, broken and bloody, had somehow righted itself. Jack stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the cool tile, sipping lukewarm coffee and staring out the window toward the sea. The breeze smelled like salt and rosemary. For a man who'd lived half a decade in concrete and steel, the sound of waves was enough to make his eyes sting. Tank lay just a few feet away, resting on an old quilt Abby had spread beside the fireplace. His breathing was shallow but steady, his eyes alert. Several guests had stopped to pet him gently throughout the afternoon, whispering things like, "Good boy," and "You're a hero." Jack knew those weren't empty words. The dog at his feet had carried the evidence that saved his life. Abby moved through the living room, quietly collecting empty plates and paper napkins. Her pregnancy was starting to show, just enough for the nearest relatives to comment on it in whispers and soft smiles. "You doing okay?" she asked Jack when she found him alone at the sink. He nodded. "Still adjusting. Keep thinking I'm going to hear a cell door slam behind me." She touched his elbow. "It's real, you're home." He gave her a faint smile, then looked toward Tank. "Is he okay?" Abby hesitated. "He's weaker than he lets on," she admitted. "He eats a little, but not like before." Jack set his mug down. "I want to take him to the vet again. Tomorrow." "She already called," Abby said gently. "Dr. Sorensen's stopping by tonight." At sunset, the last of the guests trickled out. Reverend Nolan lingered by the porch chatting with Detective Hanover in low tones. Even Warden Grant had come by, bringing a potted succulent and a handshake that said more than words could. "Forgiveness takes time," she'd said before leaving. "But we don't always get time. Take what you've got and live like hell, to make it count." Jack liked that. When Dr. Sorensen arrived just before 8 p.m., Tank was lying on the porch beside Jack's feet. The wind had cooled and the sky had turned pink and silver above the Pacific horizon. The vet approached slowly, crouching beside the quilt. "He's still tracking you like a bodyguard," she said softly, smiling at Tank. "Hasn't left my side," Jack said. "He's holding on," she said, placing her stethoscope on Tank's ribs. "But I'm going to be honest with you, it's advanced." "How long?" She paused. "Could be days. Maybe weeks." but not months. Abby appeared behind Jack, silent. She'd heard every word. Tank's tail thumped once against the wood, if to say I know. Later that night, when the house had gone quiet, Jack lay on the floor beside Tank's bed. He had rolled out a blanket, his hand resting lightly on the dog's side. Tank dozed fitfully, occasionally opening his eyes just to make sure Jack was still there. "You held on for me," Jack whispered. "You stayed alive just to see me walk out of that prison." Tank gave a low, almost imperceptible whine. "I'd trade places if I could." Outside, the ocean whispered against the rocks. Inside, a man once condemned to die counted the breaths of a dog who had saved him, one by one. The next morning, Jack woke to the sound of Tank whining softly. He bolted upright and was by the dog's side in seconds. "Easy, boy, easy." Tank tried to stand but stumbled. "Abby!" Jack called out. She came running, one hand on her belly. "I've got him," Jack said. "Get the car ready. We're taking him in." At Oceanside Veterinary Hospital, Dr. Sorensen met them at the side entrance. She led them into a private room lined with soft lights and padded flooring. Tank collapsed onto the mat, panting heavily. "We can give him something to make him comfortable," the vet said. "But I need to tell you, this may be his way of telling us he's ready." Jack knelt beside the dog. "You hear that, Tank? You don't have to keep fighting." The dog blinked slowly, chest rising and falling like the tide. "There's one thing we haven't tried," Dr. Sorensen added. "Cornell Veterinary School's working on an immunotherapy program. Experimental. But if we can get him there in time..." "I'll pay," Jack said instantly. "Whatever it costs." The vet looked at Abby, who nodded. "We'll go with him, as a family." That evening, with the sun dipping low behind the airport tarmac, Jack cradled Tank in the backseat of an SUV while Detective Hanover drove. The aging detective had become a regular visitor, his quiet guilt over Jack's conviction turning into a kind of protective loyalty. He handled Tank's crate with surprising tenderness, lining it with the quilt from the porch. "You sure about this?" Hanover asked as he closed the back. Jack nodded. "He saved me. I'm going to fight for him now." Hanover smiled faintly. "You know what they're calling him in the papers?" "What?" "The dog who remembered." The flight to New York was private, arranged through a combination of state funds and public donations that poured in after national coverage of the trial. Reporters had dubbed Tank a canine whistleblower, and overnight he'd become a symbol for justice and loyalty. During the flight, Jack sat on the floor beside the crate, hand reaching in to touch Tank's paw. "Just hold on a little longer," he whispered. "We're almost there." Tank licked his fingers. At Cornell Veterinary College, Dr. Samantha Rodriguez, the lead oncologist, greeted them personally. "I read the file," she said. "Honestly, I didn't think he'd make the trip." "He doesn't quit," Jack said. They sedated Tank gently and wheeled him into the imaging suite. After several hours of tests, Dr. Rodriguez returned with a tablet in hand. "There's something interesting," she said, pointing to a scan. "Here, by the stomach lining." Jack squinted at the ghostly image. "It looks like metal? We think it might be the original watch stem still inside him." Jack's eyes widened. "He carried it all the way here?" Dr. Rodriguez nodded slowly. "And somehow it didn't kill him. His body walled it off. We'll remove it tomorrow." That night, Jack slept in the hospital's private guest room with Abby curled up beside him and Tank snoring softly at the foot of the bed. "You know what's crazy?" Abby whispered. "What?" "This dog is the reason our baby will have a dad." Jack reached over and took her hand. He never let go of the truth, even when everyone else did. The next morning, the surgery was quick and clean. The watch, stem, still intact with the signature Rolex crown, was removed and sealed for federal evidence. Tank woke up groggy, but alert. "Hey, buddy," Jack said, kneeling beside the table. "We're not done yet, huh?" The dog blinked slowly, and for a moment Jack could almost see that same fire in his amber eyes, the one he first saw years ago at the shelter when nobody else wanted the scarred mutt in the corner kennel. "Still fighting," Jack said. "That's my boy." The days after Tank's surgery at Cornell passed in a quiet rhythm of cautious hope. The first 48 hours were critical. Dr. Rodriguez explained that the real danger wasn't the watch stem anymore. It was how Tank's body would respond to the immunotherapy. His cancer was aggressive, his system fragile. The odds were slim. But still the German shepherd fought. Jack barely left his side. He slept in a pull-out cot next to Tank's recovery bed, rising every time the dog shifted or sighed in the night. Abby brought meals and prenatal vitamins, refusing to go back to California until they had answers. In those sterile, whitewashed halls, a new kind of family life was being stitched together, imperfect, exhausted, but fiercely bonded. On the third morning, Dr. Rodriguez entered the room with a faint smile tugging at her normally serious face. "We did another scan," she said, holding up a folder. "His primary tumors have shrunk by 5%. Jack sat up straighter. "Shrunk? It's not much, but it's something. And more importantly, we're not seeing any new growth." Jack looked down at Tank, who was still drowsy but awake. The dog's eyes were clearer than they'd been in weeks. His tail thumped once against the blanket. "He's responding," Abby whispered. Dr. Rodriguez nodded. "It's not a miracle, but it's movement in the right direction. He's got a shot." By the end of the week, Tank was up and walking short distances. The vet staff called him the legend, whispering stories of the trial he helped overturn and the evidence he literally carried inside him. They took selfies when they thought Jack wasn't looking. They brought him treats shaped like stars. But Jack didn't mind. Tank had earned every bit of stardom. In fact, it was the attention that saved them time. The state had fast-tracked a second wave of compensation for Jack after the governor's public apology. A portion of it was set aside immediately for Tank's continued care, including weekly immunotherapy injections and home monitoring. They were going home. Back in Oceanside, the return was met with quiet awe. Neighbors left welcome baskets on the porch. The local sheriff's office sent a letter of apology. A church held a candlelight vigil, not for mourning, but for gratitude. Jack carried Tank up the front steps of the little Seaview cottage, his muscles straining under the shepherd's weight, but his spirit light. "You remember this place?" he whispered. Tank's tail swept the air like a slow metronome. He gave a faint bark, just once, as Jack set him down in the living room. "Yeah," Jack said, voice cracking. "We're home." Days turned into weeks. Tank's strength grew, in tiny, defiant steps. He went from barely standing to following Jack around the yard again. He sniffed every inch of the garden, slow and methodical, as though making sure the world was still in order. Jack built a ramp off the porch for him. Abby filled the freezer with homemade dog-friendly meals. Tank began sleeping in their room, again, stretched across the foot of the bed like he used to. But even in those moments of peace, Jack knew it was all temporary. That's why he savored everything. The sound of Tank's claws clicking on the floor. The way the dog nudged open the door with his nose. The way he still rested his head on Jack's chest at night, like a living, breathing heartbeat. Every day was a gift. One afternoon, Jack received a call from the governor's office. The state wanted to organize a public ceremony, a recognition of Tank's role in the Merritt case. They wanted to award him the Governor's Medal of Valor. It had never been given to a non-human recipient before. Jack hesitated. "I don't want this to be about a photo op," he said. "This dog, he's more than a headline." The aide, on the phone, replied gently, "We know, but we also think people need to be reminded what loyalty looks like." Jack agreed on one condition, that it would take place at the house. Simple, private, meaningful. The morning of the ceremony was, crisp and bright. The backyard was dressed with rows of folding chairs and a small platform draped in navy and gold bunting. A podium was placed beneath the big oak tree Abby had always loved. Friends and supporters trickled in. Detective Hanover, Reverend Nolan, Dr. Sorensen, Warden Grant, even James Lowry, the lawyer who'd helped win the emergency hearing. Abby stood beside Jack on the makeshift stage, her hand resting on the curve of her belly. Tank sat at Jack's side in a new leather collar, a modest blue ribbon pinned just above his ID tag. He looked thinner than he once had, but his posture was proud, his gaze steady. The governor took the microphone and cleared his throat. "I don't often get to say this," he began, "but I was wrong." A hush settled over the crowd. Justice, as we know, is administered by people, and people are flawed. But sometimes, just sometimes, there's a greater force that speaks through the noise. He looked at Tank. This dog never gave up on his owner, even when the rest of the world did. He held the truth in his body. He held it in his loyalty. And because of that, Jack Merritt is a free man standing among us today. The governor stepped forward with a small velvet box. He opened it and lifted a shining gold medallion which he draped gently around Tank's neck. "By special proclamation," he said, "I award the Governor's Medal of Valor to Tank. A hero, a guardian, and a reminder that some bonds are stronger than lies." The applause was quiet but thunderous in its meaning. Tank gave a single bark. Jack knelt beside him, tears in his eyes. "You've always been my hero," he whispered. Tank leaned into him, resting his weight against Jack's chest. That night, after the guests had gone and the sun had dipped below the ocean, Jack and Tank walked the beach alone. The tide was low, and the wet sand reflected the pink sky like a mirror. Jack had rolled up his jeans, walking barefoot. Tank trotted slowly beside him, occasionally stopping to sniff driftwood or seaweed. "I don't know how much time we've got," Jack said softly. "But you gave me everything. I want you to know that." Tank stopped and turned his head, eyes glinting. Jack took the leash off. "Go ahead," he said. "You're free." Tank didn't bolt. He didn't run. He simply walked ahead, slow and steady, nose to the wind. And Jack followed. A few days later, Jack received a letter. It was from the Department of Justice. They were reopening 3 other cases, ones tied to the same corrupt prosecutor and judge. Jack's testimony and Tank's evidence had created a ripple effect. "Your dog," the letter read, "did more than save one life. He may help save others too." Jack sat on the porch, the letter in his lap, Tank lying nearby with his head on Jack's boot. He reached down and scratched behind the scarred ear. "You're not just a good boy," he said. "You're the best damn partner a man could ever have." Tank gave a little grunt and shifted closer. The wind picked up off the ocean, and the world, broken and beautiful, kept turning. 1 month after the Medal of Valor ceremony, the sun rose over the Pacific in hues of amber and gold, spilling light across the weathered deck of Jack Merritt's new home. He stood barefoot with a steaming mug of coffee in his hand, watching the horizon quietly. The ocean stretched endlessly in front of him, blue and unbothered, just like he remembered it from before everything fell apart. Behind him, inside the modest cedar-sided home built with part of his settlement from the state, a new life was taking shape. In more ways than one. Abby stepped outside, hair tousled by sleep, her belly visibly round beneath a soft cotton robe. She handed Jack a second mug and leaned into him. "Twins are kicking again," she murmured with a sleepy smile. Jack laughed softly. "They're already causing trouble. Guess they take after me." Tank patted out a moment later, nails clicking gently on the wooden boards. The German shepherd's face had aged, his muzzle nearly all gray now, but there was strength in his stride. His eyes, clear and amber, still held the same quiet intelligence they always had. He moved to Jack's side and sat, leaning into the Man like a shadow coming home. Morning, partner, Jack said, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. Tank's tail thumped once, slow and deliberate. Later that day, a small group of guests gathered for a quieter, private celebration. The guest list was short. Reverend Nolan and his wife, Warden Grant, Detective Hanover, Dr. Rodriguez, who had flown in from New York for a checkup on her favorite patient, and James Lowry, Jack's attorney-turned-friend. Tank sat in his usual spot on the porch, soaking in the attention. The kids of friends took turns posing beside him. One girl whispered in awe, "Is it true he saved your life?" Jack knelt beside her and said, "That's the truth. He didn't bark or bite or chase anybody. He just waited, and because he waited, I got a second chance." Dr. Rodriguez examined Tank on the back deck, her hands gentle as she checked his breathing and pulse. "He's holding steady," she said, pleased. "The remission is still holding. He's not out of the woods, but he's far from the edge. Now." Jack nodded, eyes damp. "Every day with him feels like a gift I never expected to get." That night, Jack couldn't sleep. He walked to the beach with Tank by his side. The moon was high and full, casting silver light across the sand. The tide whispered in and out like a lullaby. They moved slowly, man and dog, footprints side by side. Jack stopped near the rocks, sinking into the cool sand. Tank sat next to him and pressed against his leg, his breathing slow and steady. "You know," Jack said softly, "there were a lot of times I didn't think I'd ever see the sky again. That courtroom, that cell. It felt like the world forgot who I was." He looked down at Tank. "But you didn't." Tank's ears twitched. "You remembered the truth when nobody else did. You remembered what mattered." The wind tugged at Jack's shirt as he looked back out at the ocean. There's a lot of talk these days about what's real and what isn't, what justice looks like. "But sometimes," he said, voice cracking, "sometimes the truth isn't a headline or a court ruling. Sometimes the truth has 4 paws and waits quietly by the door for 5 years." When they got back home, Abby was waiting at the screen door, a worried look on her face. "Everything okay?" she asked. Jack smiled. "Yeah, just had some things I needed to say." She stepped aside to let them in. That night, Tank slept with his head resting on Jack's foot as he had so many nights before. The house creaked with comfort, the kind of quiet that only comes after storms. 2 weeks later, Jack received a phone call from the Justice Department. They had concluded an internal investigation into the prosecutorial misconduct in his case. Former Assistant DA Gregory Vance had been disbarred and was facing charges. The judge who presided over Jack's trial had quietly resigned after connections to the Coastal Haven development were exposed. "Your testimony helped overturn 2 more wrongful convictions," the DOJ rep said. "Your case is being studied in law schools now." Jack hung up the phone and sat in silence for a moment. Tank rested nearby, watching him, tail gently thumping. "You did that," Jack said. "You didn't just save me. You started something, honey." The first day of spring, Jack hosted a small community event in the park by the water. There was no press, no suits, just people who wanted to say thank you. They set up a folding table for the Tank Foundation, a nonprofit Jack and Abby had started to support the training and care of service dogs for veterans and first responders. The goal wasn't just to honor Tank, it was to carry forward his legacy. Kids handed out flyers. Veterans told stories. One woman approached Jack in tears, explaining how her son's PTSD had nearly destroyed their family, until a German shepherd named Leo entered their lives. "Dogs don't fix everything," Jack said, "but they sure help you find your way through." Tank lay at the center of it all, wearing his medal and his vest that now read, "Retired Hero." He didn't bark, he didn't move much, but his presence was enough. People understood. That evening, as the sun began to set, Jack stood on the beach again, this time with Abby's hand in his and Tank resting just behind them in the sand. Abby turned toward him, eyes shimmering with emotion. I think he knows his work is done, she said. Jack nodded. And I think he's finally at peace. They stood together in the orange glow, watching the waves roll in and out. Tank lifted his head slightly, took one deep breath and let it out. And then he closed his eyes. They buried him beneath the big oak tree in the backyard, wrapping his body in the quilt he'd always loved. Reverend Nolan said a few words, and Jack laid Tank's collar on the stone marker alongside the Medal of Valor. The engraving read, "Tank loyal to the end, brave without words, the dog who remembered." The house was quieter after that, but not empty. Jack carried Tank with him in everything, the way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he treated people. There was a steadiness in him now that hadn't been there before. A grace he hadn't earned but had been given. By a dog who never stopped believing in him. Months passed. The twins arrived in late summer, a boy and a girl. Jack held them in his arms, tears streaking down his face, whispering the names he'd chosen. Cole. Grace. He promised to tell them about Tank when they were old enough to understand. Not just as a dog, but as a symbol of love, loyalty, and the power of never giving up. Sometimes, when the tide is just right and the sky turns golden at dusk, Jack still walks that beach. He swears he can hear Tank's paws in the sand beside him, and maybe, just maybe, he's right, because some truths are too big to die. Thank you for following Jack and Tank's story. Their bond reminds us all that loyalty isn't just a word, it's an action, a sacrifice, and sometimes a lifeline. What about you? Have you ever known an animal whose love changed your life? We'd love to hear your story in the comments. Heroes for Animals.